war crimes against medics. As a way to alleviate some of the horrors of combat, social convention and international law make some individuals on the battlefield off-limits to deliberate targeting. Very often, however, in the heat of battle, these conventions are ignored, and those who should be off-limits are intentionally targeted. Rules and customs of war date back centuries. By the 18th century, the majority of the officer class in an army would be made up of the aristocracy, men of wealth and privilege. These individuals would often attempt to conduct war in a gentlemanly fashion. One of these involved the treatment of enemy officers in battle. The deliberate shooting of officers was considered barbaric and to be avoided. During the American Revolution, while it was never official policy to target officers, the Continental Army did create a unit of sharpshooters who made use of highly accurate long-range rifles, giving them the ability to pick specific targets as opposed to their regular Army counterparts who were armed with much less accurate smoothbore muskets. Under the command of frontiersman Daniel Morgan, these rifles played a decisive role at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. According to legend, one of his men, Timothy Murphy, under Morgan's orders, deliberately shot and killed British General Simon Fraser. Morgan's other men also targeted other officers and artillerymen, throwing the British advance into confusion, allowing the Continental Army to win the battle. Exactly what did happen is a bit vague, but Fraser and the other officers were definitely targeted by American sharpshooters, giving the Continental Army a decisive advantage. While there was never an official policy to target such individuals, those with the means to do so were more than willing to seek out officers for special attention, no matter how barbaric it may seem. Hey everyone, it's Kane. Have you ever found yourself staring into the abyss of a blank wall, craving a hint of culture? Enter Displate, a mixture of 51% art, 46% tech wizardry, and a sprinkle of about 3% magic. And behold, it's metal, like literally metal. A veritable treasure trove of designs await you, from Star Wars to Marvel, all captured on this slice of industrial art. The pièce de résistance is magnets. You can go from holding it to hanging it in a mere 20 seconds. It's like an exercise in simplicity, like breathing, but with better wall decor. Did I mention that each purchase supports the earth in a very literal way? For every Displate you buy, a tree gets planted, a real oxygen-producing tree. Purchase and plant in one fell swoop. Want a discount? Click the link in the description. 1 to 2 Displates are 20% off, 3+ Displates are 30% off. Your future self will thank you. Over the years, restrictions on targets were formalized into official treaties. One of the most prominent of these restrictions is the prohibition of medics and medical personnel as legitimate targets. Some nations, however, not only refused to acknowledge these international guidelines, but also made the deliberate targeting of medics a standard tactic to be used by their armed forces. Two treaties that govern the conduct of soldiers on the battlefield are the Hague Convention and the Geneva Convention. The latter is a series of agreements dating back to 1864, which governed the conduct of soldiers on the battlefield. It was updated in 1906, 1929, and most recently in 1947. Though additions have been made and the exact wording of the treaty has changed over the years, any deliberate attack on a medic or medical personnel, or any unnecessary hindrance in the performance of their duties is considered a war crime and can be prosecuted accordingly. Furthermore, medics are not to be taken as prisoners of war. Should one be captured, he should be returned to friendly lines as soon as practical, and no distinction is to be made between military medical staff and civilians. Temporary auxiliary medical personnel, such as stretcher bearers and those who transported wounded or sick soldiers, are also considered non-combatants, while performing their duties and given the same consideration as designated medics. Medics are allowed to carry weapons for personal protection or to defend the wounded under their care without forfeiting their status as a non-combatant. However, should the medic engage in offensive combat alongside other soldiers, he would forfeit his immunity and be treated like any other soldier. For the most part during World War II, medics did not carry weapons, though there were some exceptions. To ensure these personnel are easily identified to ensure their protected status, many nations would mark them with special symbols, most often a red cross on a white background. This symbol would be displayed on tents, vehicles, as well as helmets and armbands as a quick visual reminder of the special status of the bearer. During World War II, most major powers were signatories of the conventions, including the United States, Great Britain, and Germany. By and large, these nations respected medics and avoided deliberately shooting them while they tended to the wounded. There were some exceptions to this. For example, some SS units would intentionally wound enemy soldiers. When medical aid arrived on the scene to treat the casualty, the SS soldier would fire on the medic, hopefully killing him. There are also incidents of Allied soldiers firing on German medical personnel in clear and deliberate violations of the Hague and Geneva Conventions. While there are many examples of this happening on both sides, for the most part, the non-combatant status of the medics was respected on the Western Front. Medics would often tend to soldiers of either side. In one example, a pair of American medics used a French church as an aid station on D-Day, 1944. Wounded soldiers from both sides were given the same treatment. The only restriction was that all patients had to leave their weapons outside. Both American and German soldiers' lives were saved due to their intervention. On the Eastern Front, the situation was entirely different. The Soviet Union did not sign the Geneva Convention, and the Hague Conventions were signed by Russia in 1899 and 1907, with the Soviet Union never confirming its status as signatory, which provided the justification for Nazi mistreatment of both prisoners and medical staff. When in combat, medics would be treated like any other soldier and would be eliminated without hesitation. Should a Soviet medic be captured, he would be sent to a POW camp as any other soldier. Conditions in these camps were horrendous, with the Nazi regime deliberately underfeeding Soviet POWs. The main aims of the German war effort in the Eastern Theater of the war was Lebensraum, or living space, for ethnic Germans. As a result, treating the Soviets, be they medic, prisoner, or any other protected class, with utter contempt flew in the face of the Nazi ideology. In response, Soviet soldiers also didn't respect German medics or medical personnel. The war on the Eastern Front was one of untold brutality, with both sides committing atrocities against the other with no regard for international law. Across the globe in the Pacific theater of the war, another military would make the killing of medics a priority. As the United States and other Allied powers conducted their island-hopping campaign, it was soon apparent that the non-combatant status afforded to those in medical fields was not applicable. Although the Empire of Japan did sign the Hague Convention in 1907, and it also signed the Geneva Convention of 1929, but it didn't ratify it. Japanese leadership believed that upholding the treaty would encourage the Americans to bomb Japanese cities, as any captured airmen would be treated as legitimate POWs rather than war criminals, which was what the Japanese considered them to be. As a result, the provisions of the conventions were ignored. While on campaign, many medics found themselves the subject of special attention from their Japanese foes. The red cross on a white background that was worn on both helmets and armbands, symbols that in other theaters provided a degree of protection, did little more than single out the wearer as the subject of special attention. Medics and corpsmen would remove these insignia and wear the same uniforms as their comrades, as any feature that distinguished them as medical personnel would only put their lives in unnecessary risk. Additionally, medics and corpsmen in the Pacific Theater would routinely carry weapons and fight alongside their comrades. Though it was a direct violation of the Geneva Convention, there was little point in following its rules, as the enemy didn't respect the convention anyway. Army medic and Medal of Honor recipient Desmond Doss noted the Japanese obsession for attacking medical personnel. In one interview after the war, he stated, quote, "To them, the most hated men in our army were the medics. They would let anybody get by just to pick us off. They were taught to kill the medics for the reason that it broke down the morale of the men, because if the medic was gone, they had no one to take care of them. All the medics were armed, except me." End quote. As Doss states, the main reason for targeting medics was to harm American morale. Should a soldier be wounded, it should be the actions of a medic that would be the difference between life and death. Should the medic be killed or otherwise incapacitated, there would be no immediate aid for any other wounded soldier. For centuries, the designation of legitimate and illegitimate targets has been enforced both as a social convention and in formal treaties. In spite of this, many have simply ignored these restrictions in order to gain an advantage on the battlefield.